reason we founded the Red Nation was to provide an alternative to what we typically view as organizing by nonprofits and big green NGOs that dominate indigenous movements. What if we created an entirely independent, indigenous-led political organization that was 100% people-powered, people-financed, and didn't accept money from large foundations or the colonial state? When Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were confronted with the annihilation of their nations and homelands, was their first reaction to create a corporate board and fundraise money from the very people taking your lands? No. Their first reaction was to get it on. And so we get it on, as we have always done. Some want to shame us for this, much in the same way both Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were shamed by their own people for their strident stances and for their profound love for their people and their lands. This is not to say we don't recognize the role of nonprofits, play in the movement, whether providing resources or jobs. But it is to understand the limitations of this way of organizing. Once a funder decides your organization is too political or too radical, and I can speak from personal experience, that money can be taken away, where a funder may step in and try to dictate the direction of the work. The next thing you know, you're answering to an APR, and if you know what that means, great. If you don't, great. Or a foundation board. And not the people whom you're supposed to represent and serve. After all, who elects the board members of these foundations and NGO boards? Certainly not everyday people. Oftentimes these boards and funders are rich white people who are simply reallocating wealth they have stolen in the first place from labor of the working poor as well as from indigenous lands. So why not create an organization that is entirely accountable and composed of the very people you represent? That seems like a no-brainer, but it is incredibly difficult to achieve. In some respects, when we tell people we don't take money or we don't have a corporate board, we get a confused look because nonprofits and NGOs have become so normalized. Typically, we view these organizations as saviors of indigenous communities, and everyday people become disempowered because they are taught to fear their own freedom and power, and they are taught to wait for someone else to fix their problems for them. In other parts of the world, NGOs from the United States and from the First World become colonial and imperial instruments of rule to prevent poor and colonized people from achieving independence and freedom. NGOs in the poor nations are simply known as poverty pimps because they profit from the misery and continued immiseration of the world's poor. For example, Haiti, a nation that has been ravaged by centuries of colonialism, has the most NGOs and humanitarian organizations per capita than anywhere in the world. Groups that promise to improve healthcare, quality of life, and develop what is otherwise a third world nation. How has the inundation of NGOs improved the lives of everyday Haitians? We must ask ourselves. The question could be posed of Indian country. We have an alphabet soup of federal programs and departments, BIA, BIE, TANF, IHS, WIP, etc., and countless other nonprofits and NGOs who promise to fulfill the services of these programs when they are defunded or underfunded. And let's not forget these federal program departments were created with the purpose of colonizing indigenous peoples first and foremost. But if anyone is aware, these programs and federal services are also meant to provide education, food, healthcare, housing, and social services. In other words, fundamental human rights. While politicians and some of our own people see these services as quote-unquote privileges, as indigenous peoples who have signed treaties in the so-called nation-to-nation relationship with the United States, we relinquished lands for these privileges of healthcare, education, welfare, etc. But these are not privileges. These are treaty rights, and for everyone else, they are human rights. What has the United States given up to take away our fundamental human rights? Nothing. They have only taken. That is why us Lakotas call the colonizers, the capitalists, Washichus, the fat takers. And when non-natives ask us, what do you want? We have said over and over and over and over again, we want you to uphold your promises to us. We signed these treaties with your government, and they are your treaties too. Have you read them? Do you know that your government signed more than 300 treaties with indigenous nations? Do Do you know that the US confirmed more than 300 times that we are nations? If you are learning the laws of this colonial nation, are you taught that Article 6 of the US Constitution says, all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land? This says nothing of the countless indigenous customary laws that derive directly from the earth. A simple request from us is that you honor your own constitution. And so, when we think about this in the context of what it means for working towards indigenous liberation and why we have chosen the path that we have chosen, it's because as indigenous peoples, to exert self-determination, to exert sovereignty, those are not things that are granted to us. Those are things that we enact on an everyday basis. Liberation is the day-to-day, week by week, year by year, generation by generation, steady accretion of building and living. It is not unique to this particular moment in time, whether at Standing Rock or elsewhere, but in fact builds on centuries of traditions of indigenous resistance. We are more than trauma stories. If we go back to the ghost dance that was troubling and unrelenting for the United States back in which it began in 1888, oftentimes Wounded Knee, the massacre at Wounded Knee overshadows our view of the ghost dance and what it actually meant. The ghost dance was a liberation movement. It was indigenous-led, it was multinational. There were hundreds of indigenous nations that participated in it. And what they advocated for was nothing short of the total departure of the colonial system in the United States government. But we are taught to view the ghost dance solely through the lens of trauma, that our ancestors made a mistake and were thus murdered and destroyed for it. But because of ghost dancers, their prophecy was fulfilled at Wounded Knee 2 in 1973, and it was fulfilled in Standing Rock in 2016 and 2017. It is these traditions of indigenous resistance that we, indigenous peoples, build upon. Historical trauma suggests that trauma is a past trauma, that's something that is exceptional to a certain time period. But as we see, just looking around Gallup, New Mexico, Rapid City, South Dakota, there's nothing historical about this trauma, and that it is ongoing. So the most comforting thing for me is knowing that we are not unique, special, or exceptional in this particular moment in time, but part of a long global tradition of resistance that extends beyond Turtle Island, that extends to the continents of Africa and Asia, where poor people have fought for their liberation and have achieved it and had it, like us, taken away. So even if our politics are decolonial in the United States, no matter how radical or sharp they may be, we must wonder why we are not free at this particular moment. And it is because freedom is the long game of liberation. It is not something that happens overnight. It is not something that you can fund into existence. It is something that is struggled for, it is something that is fought for, and is something that many, many have died for. And so to recognize this, to embrace it, we have to embrace the history and politics of the majority of the world, the poor, the darker nations, and recognize that here in Turtle Island, that we are not unique, that we have a common struggle with the people of Ireland, with Palestine, with the still colonized continent of Africa, and elsewhere in the global south. And we must also remember the resources extracted here fuel this white supremacist empire's envoys abroad. And we must understand settler colonialism as, first and foremost, an imperial project that is not limited to the United States. So if settler colonialism is imperialism, then by default, people in the first world share a reality in common with the world's poor. And this requires a reorientation of politics, that the colonial state cannot be the horizon of struggle if ours is the majority world experience. We do not just owe it to ourselves, but we owe it to the world. How do we address American exceptionalism in indigenous movements if we share this world experience? And one way is to begin to think beyond the borders that have been imposed upon us. And with that, I want to end that as kind of like a question posed to you as we think about indigenous movements and as we think about revolutionary struggles, that we are not unique and that we are part of a longer global tradition. And because we are not unique and we are not exceptional, we find comfort in that.